The Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." The Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate, and they did, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live forever." The Gospel of the Lord. A national survey was done a few years ago by the Barna Group, and there was just one simple question on that survey. The question was, what is the phrase that you most long to hear? There were three top answers that came back on that survey. The overwhelming answer was really not at all surprising. It was, "I love you." And then in a solid second place was the phrase, "I forgive you." And the third most long to hear phrase was, "Dinner is ready." I find it quite fascinating that these three answers articulate the deepest longings and needs of every human being. The Jesus we meet this morning in John's Gospel understood these deepest longings that exist in people's lives. Longings for love, forgiveness, and yes, sustenance. And in the 6th chapter of John, we repeatedly hear Jesus address these three areas of human need. In this lectionary year, for 5 Sundays in a row, we hear Jesus address these deep human desires as he claims, "The bread that I present to the world so that it can eat and live is myself. This flesh and blood self." As we enter today's reading, we see the crowds becoming rather testy. After hearing Jesus say over and over and over again that he is the bread of life, the crowd gets a bit impatient and grows frustrated as they are unable to understand Jesus' abstract words. They want something more concrete, something that is easier to understand. And I have to say that after hearing this message multiple weeks in a row, we too are likely getting a bit frustrated by hearing it again and again and again. The crowd asks, "How can this man serve up his own flesh for a meal?" And we might say, "Jesus, please talk sense. Don't give us metaphor. Give us substance." Well, Jesus does not budge an inch. He responds again by hammering home the point he has been making throughout John's 6th chapter. He says, "I am telling you the truth. Only insofar as you eat and drink flesh and blood, the flesh and blood of the Son of Man, do you have life within you. The one who brings a hearty appetite to this eating and drinking has eternal life. My flesh is the real food, and my blood is the real drink." I don't think we fully understand how mind-shattering and grotesque Jesus' words were to the people at that time. What Jesus is saying, eating a person's flesh and drinking a person's blood, has always been a sinful act. Such practice and behavior has always been regarded as an abomination by the law and the prophets. And quite frankly, Jesus' words are gross and grotesque when we truly listen to them. They assault our sensibilities and our understanding of what is ethical and not ethical. If we truly listen to Jesus' words, his assertion sounds uncomfortably cannibalistic. Quite honestly, I know some pastors who try to avoid preaching on this passage simply because of this. That's why I really like the story UCC pastor Martin Copenhaver shares as he talks about Jesus' words today in our practice of communion. Copenhaver described what happened when one of his parishioners, a little child, really listened to the words he used in preparation for communion. He writes, "The communion table was draped, as always, in starched linen and set with silver chalices and plates and a crystal flagon. The congregation was silent, even somber, as I began carefully reading the words of institution in a very solemn tone meant to add dignity to the proceedings. And on this one occasion, when I repeated Jesus' familiar words, 'This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you,' a small girl suddenly said in a loud voice, 'Ew, yuck.' The congregation looked horrified, as if someone had splattered blood all over the altar, which, in effect, is just what the little girl had done with her exclamation. For the past few weeks, we have been hearing Jesus say he is the bread of life. However, with the words Jesus speaks in today's reading, he ups the ante and takes it to a whole new level. Jesus uses language that is startling. And as Copenhaver continues his story, he writes, "In this passage, language is pressed to the limits to express the indissoluble union and inextricable participation of one life in another. For those who receive Jesus, the whole Jesus, his life clings to their bones and courses through their veins. He can no more be taken from the believer's life than last Tuesday's breakfast can be plucked from one's body." Yes, today's Jesus presses language to the limits as we reach the heart of John's gospel. Today's reading from John is all about communion. In the Gospel of John, there is no Last Supper. It's interesting to compare the Gospels. In John, you will not find a Last Supper as we do in the other Gospels. So scholars believe that the words we hear today provide John's version of the institution of what we now call the Eucharist. And with Jesus' graphic, gritty, grotesque words, we begin to see just what is at stake for Jesus and how much we are valued in his eyes. Jesus confronts us with the claim of a carnal God, the God who becomes incarnate and takes on human flesh and bones and blood. And in Jesus, we see the God whose flesh will be stretched upon the cross for our sake, the God whose blood will flow freely from his broken, wounded hands and feet and side, all for the sake of God's love for us. In Jesus, we see God's love absorbing us into God's very life, as we are made part of God's ever-widening family. And when we eat this bread and drink of this cup, we live into God's ever-widening family, as God's love embraces all people regardless. In her new book, Love Without Limits, who you may have seen I've been pushing lately, and that'll be Kim's book study in September, Jacqueline Bussey talks about this aspect of communion. She writes, "To be honest, the ritual of communion with its repetition of Jesus' words, 'My blood shed for you and for all people,' has always troubled me. For what does that really mean, to drink Jesus' blood? We often assume it's about sacrifice and pouring out blood to appease a vengeful God. But I have come to believe that it's about something else. As humans, we're obsessed with blood and bloodlines. Many of the ugliest things we've ever done to one another were motivated by the desire to keep our blood pure and uncontaminated by others. Consider the Nazi hatred for people of Jewish blood, or the widespread discrimination against people with HIV/AIDS. Consider also the racist U.S. miscegenation laws that made it illegal until 1967 for African Americans and whites to intermarry. Miscegenation is a Latin word that literally means mixing of the families. Blood has long been our idol. To counter all this horrible hatefulness, Jesus uses the symbolic meal of communion. Every sip of the wine contains a lesson. The same blood runs through everyone's veins. As we drink down this truth, we share in Jesus' bloodline and become one family, the human family. Communion shares the same doormat as Jesus' words to us today. Welcome to my family. You are now all related. Of course, we are a broken people